Welcome back to our series about exploring the meaning of Christian identity by exploring the sojourning history of Israel. In the last section, we looked at the stories of Cain and Abel, Abraham and Sarah, and Jacob and Esau, and their experiences as Habiru. In this section, we will explore the family dynamics of Jacob's family and the relationship that they had with their Canaanite neighbors. We will then look at the story of Joseph and the beginning of Israel's experiences in Egypt. Now, although the end point of the Exodus story has been marred by the conquest of Canaan, which has been subsequently used in the past to justify colonization, among other things, I believe that reframing both the Exodus and the conquest as an extension of the siblings archetype, as expressed earlier in conjunction with the liminal sojourn and return experience, will do much in reframing how these two events stand in relation to the other. This is because the conquest is often interpreted as an ethnic struggle, bordering on genocide. However, what will be demonstrated here is that ethnically and culturally, the Israelites and the Canaanites were really one and the same people. The Israelites were really Canaanites, who took up the shepherd archetype by sojourning to Egypt and returned a changed people through their liminal experience, while the Canaanites who never left Canaan expressed the farmer archetype, by particularly being tied to the urban power centers in contrast to the more pastoral Hebrews. Now, when we look at the early lives of the patriarchs of the 12 tribes, we see something peculiar and authentic to real immigrant and diasporic experience. This is because if we count Abraham's generation as being first-generation immigrants, then the generation of Joseph and his brothers would have been fourth-generation immigrant Canaanites. This is significant because contemporary immigrant experiences show us that immigrant families usually become fully assimilated into the host culture by at least the third generation on average. The scholar Jean-Pierre Ruiz reports that adult immigrants in the United States typically combine instrumental learning of English with efforts to maintain their culture and language. They also seek to pass this heritage to their children. The instrumental acculturation of the first generation in the United States is followed by a second generation that speaks English in school and the parental languages at home, often responding to remarks in those languages in English. Limited bilingualism leads almost inevitably to English becoming the home language in adulthood. By the third generation, any residual proficiency in the foreign language is lost, since it is supported neither outside nor inside the home. Additionally, research has shown that linguistic assimilation is significantly affected by intermarriage. In one important study of mother tongue shift to English, Gillian Stevens reports that children of two foreign parents are most likely to learn a parent's non-English language. Those with one foreign parent are less likely, and those with two native-born parents are least likely. Stevens reports that with almost half of the children in the study belonging to ethnically heterogeneous backgrounds, few of these children learn the parent's non-English mother tongue. And Stevens therefore concludes that non-English languages are disappearing through mother tongue shift in large part because of ethnic intermarriage. However, is there any evidence of this occurring among the biblical patriarchs? Well, perhaps surprisingly to some, there actually is, in agreement with contemporary research nevertheless. This is because Jacob and Esau would have been the third generation in which this language/culture shift would begin to happen. Indeed, when we look at Esau, we see that he shows his complete assimilation into the Canaanites by marrying native-born Canaanite women, to the dismay of his parents, as it is written in Scripture. When Esau was 40 years old, he married Judith, daughter of Beri the Hittite, and Basemath, daughter of Elon the Hittite, and they made life bitter for Isaac and Rebekah. So that is from Genesis 26, 34 to 35. Additionally, We have reason to believe that the issue may not have been the women themselves. Like, there was nothing wrong with them personally. But the fact that Isaac and Rebekah wanted to maintain the foreign identity of the family, as Isaac would later tell Jacob, "You shall not marry one of the Canaanite women. Go at once to Padan Aram, to the house of Bethuel, your mother's brother." So that's from Genesis 28. And again, when Esau saw that the Canaanite women did not please his father Isaac, Esau went to Ishmael and took Mahalath, daughter of Abraham's son Ishmael, and sister of Nebaioth, to be his wife, in addition to the wives he had in Genesis. Thus, Jacob's parents wanted him to stay within the family's cultural heritage, which is why Esau also felt compelled to marry a descendant of Abraham. He married a descendant of Ishmael, who was a son of Abraham, in order to redeem himself before his parents. Indeed, Abraham himself had the same concern for his own son Isaac when he said, "You will not get a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites, among whom I live, but will go to my country and to my kindred and get a wife for my son Isaac." So here we see that the parents, Isaac and Abraham, they both had concerns with maintaining the cultural identity of their family and of their children, and they did that by refusing to marry into the local Canaanite communities, and instead preferred to find women from their own country in order for their sons to marry. But did this really have any effect on limiting the family's assimilation? If we look at Jacob's reception in his mother's country, it may not have. This is because despite sharing a common ancestry and ethnic heritage with Laban, Jacob was nevertheless perceived as being a foreigner to Laban's family, since Jacob's wives would later say, so in Genesis 31, they would say, "Is there any portion or inheritance left to us in our father's house? Are we not regarded by him as foreigners? For he has sold us, and he has been using up the money given for us." In other words, by marrying a foreigner who was Jacob, Laban no longer saw his daughters as being his responsibility, since they are now members of a foreign nation by being wedded to the foreigner Jacob. This is why he felt free to squander whatever money he would have owed them for their dowries. This is important because it implies that despite being ethnically related, Jacob was nevertheless perceived as being culturally distinct and different from the people who were supposed to be his relatives in northern Syria, in Aram, which implies a degree of his assimilation into the culture and language of the Canaanites. So when Jacob went back to Aram, his own relatives saw him as being somehow different. They saw him as being foreign. Reflecting on his own experience of being Korean but culturally Americanized, the scholar Jean-Pierre Lee writes, "When I returned to Korea, I discovered that I have become an alien in my homeland because of my Americanization. Although I once moved back to Korea with a permanent teaching job in Seoul, I had to return to North America. I have discovered that I belong neither to my homeland nor to North America." Now, Jean-Pierre Lee is a first-generation Korean American, but he observes that this experience is even worse among second-generationers, writing, "Most second-generation Asian Americans are alien not only to Americans and Asians, but also to their own parents. That makes them a lost generation. Culturally, they are Americans because of assimilation through public education, but racially, they are Asian and unassimilated because of their immutable physical Mongolian appearance in the Caucasian-dominated world." Thus, Isaac and Rebekah saw Esau as a lost generation, and feared Jacob going the same way. But alas, these two brothers were already third generation since Abraham left Haran. And when Jacob decided to return to Canaan, God said, "Return to the land of your ancestors and to your kindred, and I will be with you." Now, this should be shocking if we remember that Jacob was told this while still living in Abraham's homeland among his kin. God said that to Jacob while he was living with Laban, his relatives, where Abraham migrated from, which implies that Jacob no longer personally identified with Haran, the preceding land of his ancestors, but with Canaan, their new adopted land, which they immigrated to. This means that Jacob did in fact identify more with Canaan and with the Canaanites than with the people of his own ethnic heritage. Indeed, it would not make sense for Isaac and Rebekah to feel worried about Jacob marrying a Canaanite if he did not already feel so inclined to do so. Abraham and Isaac sought to preserve their foreign identity by marrying immigrant women from the old country. However, this still did not prevent the eventual assimilation of their children. In fact, Isaac being second generation meant that he would have at least been bicultural, while his children, being third generation, would have recognized Canaanite as being the more socially accessible sphere, despite the foreign culture that they would have been acquainted with at home. But because this was limited to the home, the greater social capital of the native culture is socially in society is still what won out in the long run as they increasingly transitioned from biculturalism to monoculturalism. In other words, due to the social capital that would have been associated with the native born, the foreign born are usually assimilated in the direction of the native born, not the other way around. This is why in the act of cultural exchange, Rebekah would have more likely absorbed more of the Canaanite culture that both her native-born husband and children knew than for them to preserve and absorb much of the culture that she and her foreign-born parents-in-law, Abraham and Sarah, would have come from in return. This, of course, would result in the overall dominance of the native culture even within the family in the end. And anecdotally, in the another example is that in the background of my own family story is that on my German side of my family, the first ancestor that came on that side, they came to America in around the 1860s. And every generation involved a foreign-born German immigrant, first generation, coming over and marrying a native-born German American. And that happened every generation. And yet, the German language died out anyways, because English was the more dominant and socially useful language. Which is why up to this day, none of my relatives who were born in America can speak German, because it was useless in this country. Similarly, on my Haitian side, I have a grandmother whose father came from China, and she wanted to learn Chinese, but her father said, there's no point in doing that because Chinese just isn't useful in this country. Therefore, even if people in the family wanted to learn the language, their ability to do so is limited because it cannot be used outside of their own homes, which is why eventually it will die out because it's useless socially outside in the main world. So this is why the native the language of the native born country, the native country that they would have immigrated to, is what is always going to win out in the long run. This can further be evidenced when we look at the generation of Joseph and his siblings, who would have been fourth generation from Abraham. When we look at a story about Judah in particular, we see that he has no qualms with participating in Canaanite norms, like temple prostitution in particular. You can read about that in Genesis 38:15-21, despite supposedly being Jewish and a worshiper of the God of Abraham. If you know anything about Judaism, temple prostitution isn't something that should happen. But at this time, they didn't see themselves as being quote-unquote Jews. They saw themselves as being Canaanites. In fact, Judah himself would marry a Canaanite. You can read that in Genesis 38 too. And we have no reason to believe that Tamar, who would become his daughter-in-law was also not a Canaanite, which would suggest his full assimilation into Canaanite culture. Thus, other than practicing circumcision, which is, you can see in Genesis 34:13 to 15, they had that. That was the covenant, part of the covenant that Abraham received with God, and worshiping the God of Abraham over and against other gods. We have no evidence that, culturally speaking, they were anything else but Canaanite. Again, suggesting complete assimilation at this point. This would again mirror contemporary patterns among immigrants, in that usually it is religious practices that are the things that usually remain as the only identifiers of having had a foreign past. If you look at the background of many American immigrants, or actually just plain Americans who had immigrant ancestors, religious customs are usually the only thing that remains. Like long after one's ancestors came from Ireland, being Catholic is the only Irish thing about them sometimes. Or being Catholic is the only thing that makes a person Polish sometimes, long after they forgot how to speak Polish. So religious traditions, these are usually the only things that survive complete assimilation. Otherwise, language, culture, traditions, they become assimilated. But it is also interesting to note the liminality that Jacob's children were born into. This is because they were likely bicultural. All of them beside Benjamin were born in their mother's country in Haran, with the oldest of the bunch having been raised there for about 13 years, which you can count out in Genesis 31, verse 41. We also see that after immigrating, their mothers were also still attached to their native culture, because they wanted to bring the idols that they were accustomed to worshiping with them. You can read about that story also in Genesis 31, verse 19. Notably, it was not until sometime later, after they settled in Canaan and the older children were more or less grown up, that the family actually discarded the old gods for Abraham's God, which you can read about in Genesis 35. In fact, in Genesis 35, 1 to 4, we can read, "So Jacob said to his household and to all who were with him, Put away the foreign gods that are among you, and purify yourselves. So they gave to Jacob all the foreign gods that they had, and Jacob hid them under the oak that was near Shechem." This would mean that for better or for worse, the tribal patriarchs were not actually raised to be strict monotheists, but would have identified with both Jacob's God as well as their mother's gods, being in both worlds while truly belonging in neither. Thus, when they came into Canaan, they would not have thought twice about assimilating into the Canaanite culture as well. Since being liminal and multicultural, they had no strong structural attachments to really defend or preserve as being essential. So they would have felt free, therefore, to mingle with the Canaanites as an extension of their already mixed identities. So in other words, they were already used to living in these mixed backgrounds. So just adding another piece, into their mixed identities, which in this case would be embracing Canaanite culture, probably wasn't that problematic for them. And I'm talking about Jacob's children here. And also, their assimilating into the Canaanite culture would only have been facilitated by the fact that Jacob himself also probably personally identified with the Canaanites for reasons that we have shown before, so that the Canaanites were not really seen as being that foreign or alien to begin with to them. Indeed, the siblings probably saw the Canaanite culture as just being their father's culture, since that's where their dad came from, and so felt no contradiction in embracing it. It should therefore be of no surprise that we read that the children of Jacob had rather amicable relations with Canaanite persons. For example, Dinah, who was the one daughter of Jacob's family, was able to make friends with the women of the region. You can read about that in Genesis 34:1. The native born Canaanites also seem to have viewed them rather positively as being people who were easily assimilable. You can read about that again in Genesis 34, 20 to 23. In fact, they said, "These people," referring to Jacob's family, "are friendly with us. Let them live in the land and trade in it, for the land is large enough for them. Let us take their daughters in marriage, and let us give them our daughters." So the Canaanites were saying that in regards to Jacob's family. They saw them as being friendly and easily assimilatable. Judah, in addition to marrying a Canaanite woman, which itself again implies assimilation, is also described as having Canaanite friends. You can read about them in Genesis 38:20. So the idea that Israelites and Canaanites were eternal enemies is frankly a myth. In reality, they saw each other as being nearly the same people. And the adaptability of Jacob's children is again another pattern that is observable among contemporary children of immigrants. When we look at the children of immigrants today, like they assimilate and learn English like super quickly. The younger that they are, the more odds will be in their favor that they will be able to speak English without any foreign accent at all. They sound pretty American. You probably couldn't tell just by listening to them that they were born someplace else. In fact, again, with referring back to my own family history, I had a great aunt who was born in Germany as a small child, and they moved to the United States in the 1920s. And when they came into Wisconsin, they lived in a Czech town because their mother was Czech. So they grew up speaking German and Czech. And after that, they went to Milwaukee to a German speaking community. And so they began to speak German again. And as they got older, and then they started going to school, they started learning English, and they started to add American friends and American culture into the repertoire. And so they were able to integrate as children. They were able to integrate and assimilate and really navigate these different communities, cultures, and languages remarkably easily because, again, children are very adaptable. They can just take in everything around them. So it would be no surprise if Jacob's children behaved in the same way concerning the peoples around them. When the family later immigrated to Egypt, we can again see more of the same pattern. But before we get there, though, it would help to see Joseph's story, which precedes them. The fact that Joseph was among the youngest of the siblings is important because it would mean that he spent the least amount of time in his mother's country and the most of his formative years in his father's. Additionally, because he was his father's favorite, he may have also been closer, more personally identified with his father, which would mean a closer affiliation with his father's God, whereas the older siblings may have been less strict in their monotheism due to their having more time with and living in their mother's cultures. This therefore may have been the reason for Joseph's becoming God's chosen, since his father's religion may have been more dominant in his life and early formation compared to his other siblings. If we can imagine a spectrum between monotheism and polytheism, Joseph's older siblings may have been likely somewhere in the middle, which shows in their amicability towards the surrounding peoples. Though they believed in Abraham's God, they may have also been open to other influences as well, given their multicultural upbringing. Joseph, on the other hand, was likely more towards the monotheistic end of the spectrum. Having spent the least amount of time with his mother's culture, as well as the fact that his mother probably died when he was still somewhat young, his father's culture would have been more dominant, so that even if he was aware of the other gods around him, he identified with his father's God the most, since his father would have been the greatest influence on him. His father would have been the more dominant presence in his life. Thus, with multiculturalism now being the norm, Joseph would have become marginalized by being devoted to only one God. So, When Joseph began telling his dreams from God to his family, detailing how God shows him and his brothers will bow to him, which you can read about in Genesis 37:5-8, he was therefore seen as piling God's favor onto himself because of his more focused devotion relative to his brothers. So his brothers' anger was probably not just based on his being their father's favorite, but also because he was claiming to be better than them religiously too. In this way, Joseph would portray the persecution and marginalization that monotheists would experience within their polytheistic communities or families during that time. But this is not simply about persecution, but is also a lesson about humility, since Joseph's persecution happened because of a lack of humility. But after Joseph was sold by his brothers into slavery, he would become doubly marginalized, not just in faith, but in ethnicity and culture too, as a Hebrew in Egypt. Thus, Joseph carries on his father's legacy by becoming the shepherd archetype. Whereas his brothers assimilated with the native people of the land, expressing the settling down mentality of the farmer archetype, Joseph remained a shepherd, who, like Abel, was a dreamer. This is why the violence between Joseph and his brothers can be seen as a continuation of the struggle between the farmer and the shepherd archetypes, with God still being present among the shepherd who experiences marginalization from the farmer, is made to live in liminality in a foreign land, and returns home to reconciliation amongst their farmer siblings. Although in this case, the reconciliation will happen in Egypt instead of Joseph returning home to Canaan. Home is brought to him. And so in the next section, we will explore Joseph's story deeper and his experiences as a slave and a Hebrew in Egypt, and how this changed him to become a person who went from a person who was prideful to a person who understands the meaning of humility and service as God's chosen.